Hello. Today we want to look at the process of making policies. Previously, we examined the meaning of policy, the characteristics of policy, the types of policies, as well as the functions of policies. With that understanding, we now want to look at another important part of policy, and this is policy making process. I wish to begin by having a recap of key issues around policy, at least to set the pace and the mood for our discussion today. It is important to observe that a public policy is an institutional proposal, such as laws, regulations, guidelines, and also actions, which are designed to address a problem that is in society, and it is guided by a conception and also a program that is implemented. In that case, therefore, policy development may be understood as a process undertaken by the government to meet needs, protect rights, distribute resources, enforce laws, protect citizens, and also address other national interests. Again, we want to look at policy development in terms of the fact that it can take long to prepare and also take considerable amount of time to pass as a law, and even more important, can also take quite a lot of time for it to be executed. Why is this so? This is so because the process of developing policies is quite tedious, and it has to undergo certain sequential stages, and these stages are 5. Namely, first, we identify an issue or a problem that we think other measures that are available cannot solve, and therefore the best approach to solve it is through policies. Secondly, we formulate the policy, and then the third stage, we make a decision in terms of the various options that we consider should go into the policy, and thus form the backbone of addressing the issue of concern. Then we have the policy implementation, and then lastly, we evaluate the policy, because once you come up with a policy, implement it. And once it has been implemented, from time to time, it has to be seen or established whether it's achieving its intended goal or not, and what possible problems or roadblocks it could be facing in terms of addressing the issues that it was set out to address. The first process in policy making is what we call problem identification. Sometimes we call it issue identification. We need to understand a problem to mean a situation that produces a need or deprivation, and therefore relief is sought, and they include issues such as poverty, crime, environmental degradation, child marriage, and gender violence. These are just but examples. When we are identifying problem for purposes of policy making, we must ensure that the problem is stated clearly, well defined, the boundary set, and written in a language that is not ambiguous, because a problem that is clear is one that we're able to address in terms of understanding it and also even understanding the extent to which it manifests in society. This understanding is necessary also in terms of estimating the cost and also identifying other resources that may be needed in its implementation. A problem only becomes a policy agenda if it meets certain criteria. For instance, if it receives sufficient public attention, that is, a lot of people believe that exists and therefore it is being experienced. Again, a problem might also qualify and become a policy agenda if there is sufficient media coverage. Otherwise, an issue that the media finds not interesting and therefore not worth covering may as well mean that it is not of a pressing need to society. Again, a problem might also become a policy agenda if it is pushed by powerful individuals and groups in society. It could be politicians, it could be professionals, it could be the academia, or even other lobby groups. If they push it and clearly state it and influence other people that are at the center of policy making, then that issue might find itself in the table for discussion as a possible problem that requires a policy intervention. Again, a significant event might also make a problem qualifying as a policy issue. Such events could be in the form of tragedies such as fire, fatal road accidents, and even terrorism. These events might be due to subtle loopholes in the way society operates or in the way other sectors operate. And therefore, it may call attention to those in authorities and policy making to address it through the enactment of appropriate policies. But it's also important to note that not all issues that move onto policy agenda or that have been identified and considered as possible policy agenda may complete the policy making process and therefore become policies or become laws. Again, other criteria might or other issues might arise that either prevent them or successfully ensure that they move to the next stage for deliberation. So a problem must be identified first, clearly understood and defined, and again, it must also meet certain criteria for it to move to the next level of policy making. The second stage of policy making process is called policy options analysis. Policy option analysis refers to a structured way of evaluating and choosing alternative courses of action, and it involves looking into the future to predict what will happen as a result of different proposals being offered. The options that are considered must be realistic, they must be achievable within the defined time frame, and they should also be affordable, because when they're expensive, it may overstretch the government and in the process fail to be successfully implemented, thus undermining the achievements of the objective that it had set out to achieve. It's also important for us to ensure that The policies or the options that have been settled on must be seen to be those that meet all the criteria, not only in terms of how much it will cost and whether they are affordable or achievable, they must also be those that have been identified by a majority of stakeholders. Further, these options should also show the benefits of the policy, the problems they intend to address, and also possible obstacles they are likely to face at the implementation level. Again, the options that have been settled on must also offer a glimpse of possible opportunities that might occur in future. Simply put, when you talk about policy options, we're basically looking at the different approaches that can be used to address the issue or the problem that had been identified in step one. Because a problem might have as many as 20 ways of addressing it. Each of those ways must be evaluated using the criteria of achievability, affordability, and also whether they meet the expectations of various stakeholders. And like I've just said, the options that have been identified must also be those that we are able to identify possible hindrances so that the remedies to those hindrances might be identified early, and then they might be employed at the time when these policies are facing such challenges. The third stage of policy making process is called policy formulation. This is a stage of the policy making process in which the proposed actions are explained, discussed, and drafted into language of policy. It should be noted that whatever that will be discussed must be formulated and then drafted into a policy. Formulation of policy consists of policymakers discussing and suggesting appropriate approaches to correcting or addressing the problem that had been identified earlier. Indeed, the ultimate policy that's arrived at should be one that is able to solve the problem that was identified in stage one. And again, for this to happen, it must satisfy two important factors. One, it must have the ability to solve the problem in the most efficient and feasible way, and it also must have sufficient level of political support. If a policy is not adequately supported, either by the executive or the legislature, then it runs the risk of not being given sufficient backing in terms of financing for its implementation. Therefore, a policy that is formulated must be one that will utilize the least amount of resources and also gain sufficient political support. At the stage of policy formulation, it is also expected that policymakers will address competing proposals that have been presented by different stakeholders and also consider alternative courses of action. As we noted earlier, the making of a policy might run the risk of conflict in terms of the various approaches that different stakeholders consider are the best way of addressing the problem that had been identified. And therefore, this conflict and competition must be harmonized to ensure that the final policy document that comes out is one that is supported by all stakeholders. Otherwise, any dissenting voice might serve as an important obstacle in the implementation of the policy, either in terms of sabotage or if certain stakeholders were meant to finance certain aspects of the policy, they can dissociate themselves and therefore withhold significant funding that they had promised to give had the policy addressed the views and the concerns they felt needed to have been part of the policy. It is therefore important for policymakers to ensure that all issues that might bring differences or conflict or competition are addressed and concurrence is developed so that a policy that comes out is not one that is contested by any party. Once a policy has been formulated, it moves to the next stage, which we call policy adoption. And adoption simply means now that the policy that has been developed and accepted now goes to the relevant government department or agencies that is now going to be in charge of its implementation. Adoption can be affected by, again, the same factors that we found to be responsible for deciding whether or not an issue moves to the table for purposes of policy discussion. Again here, interest groups, the media coverage, the political goodwill, and other significant events, which I mentioned earlier, could be in form of tragedies or disasters, might also influence the adoption of the policy. Adoption of the policy simply means that the government department that is relevant or that will host the policy has now accepted it, and therefore resources, recruitment, and other things that are required to execute the policy are now being worked on. I noted earlier that certain factors might make it difficult or easier for a policy to move through from one state to the other. And again here, I want to emphasize that, again, these factors might also influence the adoption of the policy. For instance, the media can play an important role in policy adoption by reporting and giving unbiased commentary and objective debates or analysis about the policy. Otherwise, if the media chooses to give a given policy total blackout or decides to highlight only the negative aspects or the dangers that such policy poses to certain sectors, then again that can undermine the adoption of that particular policy. It's also important to ensure that various stakeholders work together in the adoption and implementation of the policy. This is because while it is the duty of the central government or the national government to ensure that a policy is implemented, the central government also needs to work with the private sectors and also regional governments, like in Kenya, county governments, for purpose of support. Because at national level, there are issues that the national government can address. Again, there are issues that the private sector might come on board to help in addressing. But lastly, regional government might also be important in terms of lending support, both in terms of finances and also the goodwill to ensure that a given policy is not only adopted, but its implementation also becomes successful. The other stage of the policy making process is called policy implementation. And by implementation, we mean the actual enactment of the proposed solutions as is being undertaken by various institutions, so that implementing a policy now means putting into practice the issues or the approaches that had been identified by stakeholders as being the most viable means or avenues of addressing the problem that policymakers had identified. Successful implementation of policy depends on three main criteria. First, the policy needs to be communicated from the creator or those who made it to the relevant governing body that has the power to enact it. Remember, for instance, a policy might be originated by the private sector, such as a civil society organization, but its implementation will require the government and its relevant arms or agencies. And therefore, it is important that the relevant government agencies are brought on board and the policy is communicated and articulated to them well. The second one is that the policy needs to be communicated clearly and also one that is easy to interpret, because for a policy to be implemented effectively, there should never be any possible cases of ambiguity that can lead to the matter being taken to court for purposes of interpretation. Again, the resources that are important in the implementation of the policy should also be put on board. Otherwise, you don't come up with a policy and now desire to implement it without bearing in mind the kind of resources that are needed to have it implemented. So all these things must be there. I want to state here that the policy implementation is a topic that we're going to deal with, and therefore here I'm merely mentioning what it is. Otherwise, there's a topic that we are going to deal with, where we are going to deal with policy implementation in a more substantial manner. The other stage of policy making process is called policy evaluation. Once a policy has been implemented, it has to be evaluated. And by evaluation, we mean the determination of how well a policy is addressing the issues that it was meant to address. Policies may be evaluated according to a number of standards, which again I want to state here that policy evaluation is also a topic that we are going to deal with in a more substantive manner. And therefore, at this juncture, I don't wish to say much about policy evaluation because we have it as a separate topic that we are going to deal with after the one on policy implementation. The last stage of policy making process is called policy termination. Termination refers to the deliberate conclusion or cessation of specific government functions, programs, policies, or organizations. Policymakers normally include termination option in the policy in view of the fact that a policy or program need not live forever. Once its objectives are reached, then it either can be reformed or completely terminated. A policy can be terminated if its applicability are found to be outmoded, if it is found to be redundant, or if it is found to be dysfunctional. For instance, if certain options that could work, say, in the 70s were included in a given policy, and that those approaches might not work today, then those particular approaches might imply that the policy is terminated on the fact that it is found out to be old-fashioned, because perhaps the approaches, it is propagating to use to address a given problem are now against certain international principles and standards to date. For instance, for quite some time, when environmental degradation was not so much a problem in the world, uh, charcoal fuel was considered as an important source of fuel. But as years go by and environmental degradation becomes real, destruction of the environment through cutting of trees is highly being discouraged. It means, therefore, that if a policy on charcoal was encouraged, charcoal burning and sale was encouraged some decades back, the same is now discouraged today. And therefore, if a policy existed that encouraged that, then that policy might now be considered as being outmoded, and in that sense might be terminated because it goes counter to the principles of environmental conservation that are being propagated worldwide. A policy might also be terminated if it failed to work or lost goodwill from critical stakeholders, such as elected officials. Indeed, you need various stakeholders for goodwill, finances, and other things. And therefore, if a policy loses traction with the key stakeholders, then that policy might not get sufficient support to make it persist and therefore continue to address the issues that was intended to address. Again, termination might also occur due to budgetary constraints and even nullification by a court of law if there are no finances to implement a policy. Indeed, we might not insist on it going on. Again, a policy might also be nullified by a court of law. If the law finds a given policy to be against the law or against certain fundamental provision of the Constitution, the court might declare it null and void. And that, if not appealed, might be considered as the end of that particular policy. At that point, I wish to stop and also wish to invite you for our next discussion, which will be on policy implementation. Thank you so much for your time.